Mongolia was once the richest nation in the world. Genghis Khan brought extreme wealth and prosperity to an exponentially expanding empire, eventually becoming the largest in history. Khan's economic policies served as the empire's backbone, enabling it to expand by swallowing conquered countries whole and trading with their plundered resources. A long period of stability known as the Pax Mongolica tightened their grip as a powerhouse, allowing trade to flourish by essentially connecting the world from west to east through the Silk Road. Although this had to end with fragmentation and a steep decline, I want to first take it way back to the beginning. How did this flat, empty landmass known as Mongolia suddenly become the world's most powerful and wealthiest empire, stretching over 24 million square kilometers? It began in the late 12th century thanks to a young man named Temujin, son of a chieftain father. His childhood was defined by the nomadic lifestyle of his tribe, the Borjigin, who roamed the harsh landscapes of Central Asia. Early on, he experienced the brutal realities of life on the steppe, scarcity of resources, tribal conflicts, and the ever-present threat of rival clans. It was within this unforgiving environment that Temujin would forge the resilience and determination that would become his hallmark. Temujin embarked on a slow, upwards journey of power. Dozens of battles were waged against various clans to mixed results. However, the alliance with key leaders such as Togrul considerably raised Temujin's renown and army size. Eventually, his following became significant enough to gain huge victories against increasingly large clans such as the Merkit and Naimans. The ascension culminated by waging and winning a war against the Kurtayt, the most powerful Mongol leader, who had assumed the title of Wang, or King Khan. Upon his ultimate triumph in 1206, Temujin bestowed upon himself the name Genghis Khan, meaning universal leader. He reunited all conflicting tribes into one large empire and subsequently expanded his dominion over the Mongol territories, consolidating his rule. As leader, Genghis Khan began to introduce policies that were far from the norm. First, he forbade the looting of defeated enemies and made sure all rewards were shared evenly between warriors. In a huge change, the upper classes were no longer treated far better than everyone else. He strongly believed in a meritocracy where individuals who displayed loyalty and competence were rewarded with higher ranking positions. He instituted a new code of law for the empire known as Yasa. This established a framework for economic conduct that promoted fairness, stability, and order. It promoted principles such as forbidding the sale of women, theft, internal conflicts among the Mongols, and hunting animals during the breeding season. Harsh penalties, such as retribution 9 times the value of stolen goods, deterred potential wrongdoers. The economy largely benefited due to Khan's attitude towards trade. He actively supported both domestic and international trade, recognizing the potential benefits. He implemented measures to safeguard merchants and traders, ensuring their assets were secure during their journeys through the vast empire. To alleviate the burden on the poor and the clergy, he exempted them from taxation. There's no doubt that Mongolia immediately benefited financially from these new leadership policies. It allowed for the empire to not just worry about internal issues, but also look outwards. Across the Asian plateau lay millions of miles of rich, vulnerable lands with vast amounts of resources ready to be plundered. For his empire to gain wealth, war and quick expansion became the only option. The invasion of Central Asia between 1216 to 1221 resulted in a huge victory, with the Mongol Empire gaining control of the entire region of modern-day Afghanistan. Despite showing empathy and fairness to his own subjects, he showed absolutely no mercy to his enemies. The Khwarezmian dynasty was completely destroyed by the Mongols, with around 25% of the entire population killed. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the empire encompassed most of Central Asia, the Middle East and Persia, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. His son, Ogedei, continued the expansionist policies. The first territory conquered was the Jin Empire, located in North China. Attention then turned to Eastern Europe. All of the Kievan Rus was taken by the Mongols by 1240. Central Europe was next, with Poland, Hungary, Croatia, Austria and Albania all plundered in 1241. It seemed the Mongols would go on to take the entire Eurasia continent, but progress sharply stopped upon the death of Ogedei Khan due to the subsequent need to elect a new Great Khan. Baghdad, home to the incredible Islamic Golden Age, was sacked in 1258. The city was sieged for 13 days, eventually resulting in its complete destruction, with hundreds of thousands of inhabitants massacred and the Abbasid Caliphate dissolving. This was perhaps one of the most devastating events in human history. Baghdad was home to the House of Wisdom, containing countless precious historical documents and books on subjects ranging from mathematics to medicine. It is said the Tigris River turned black from the ink of these priceless texts and red from the great minds who had been mercilessly slaughtered. It is estimated the loss of knowledge set human progress back centuries. This did not play on the minds of the Mongols, however, as they continued their expansion. Kublai Khan, a grandson of the great Genghis, increased Mongol rule in China. It was under his rule in the late 13th century where the empire reached its peak, now controlling much of China and Russia, as well as maintaining most of Eurasia and Middle East. Here is a look at the total land amassed by this extraordinary empire at its height. So we know how large the empire grew, but you may be thinking, how did this equate to riches? Exactly how did the empire's economy work? How did they gain wealth? What did trade consist of? And what did the everyday lives of its inhabitants look like? First, let's look at the societal and economic structures that ultimately held the empire together. The way society was structured to foster expansion was truly revolutionary and genius for the time. One of the great strengths of Genghis and his immediate successors was their openness to new ideas. Recognizing the need to strengthen his military, Genghis initiated a transformative reform. The army was structured as follows. 10 soldiers formed an arban. Every member was strictly required to be loyal to one another, regardless of background, ethnicity, or social standing. 10 arbans constituted a zun, or company. 10 zuns formed a miangan, or battalion, and 10 miangans comprised a tumen, an army of 10,000. This decimal system reform aimed to break down the traditional clan and kindred-based divisions that had previously fragmented Mongol society and its military, instead solidifying the bonds of loyalty among warriors. Each conquest offered opportunities to integrate a diverse array of people into Mongol society, including foreign engineers and laborers, enriching the empire's knowledge base and skills. So, the territorial expansion not only broadened its geographical reach, but also gave birth to new economic and technological advancements. Mongolia's central location on the Asian continent was instrumental in broader trade. The army asserted firm control over the smoothness of supply lines and trade routes. Garrisons were established to assure the safety of traveling merchants. They even planted trees along roads to ease travel during the summer months. It's clear the Mongols recognized trade as the key component of growth. The expansion allowed them to take full control of the vital east to west trade route known as the Silk Road. European merchants, including the renowned Marco Polo, embarked on journeys from Europe to China along well-maintained and mostly safe roads. This connectivity facilitated the flow of various goods. Spices such as pepper, ginger, and cinnamon made their way to the west from the Spice Islands. Eastern dietary elements were introduced to European palates. Precious pearls and gemstones found markets in Europe, along with Iranian weapons, carpets, and leather goods. Europeans exported silver, fine cloth, horses, linen, and other commodities to the Near and Far East. This two-way trade significantly boosted the GDP of nations and societies involved in the system. The Mongols themselves profited hugely from the Silk Road. As a nomadic people heavily reliant on herding and hunting for sustenance, the Mongols possessed little technological capabilities. There was little production of pottery, textiles, or any manufacturing goods. Therefore, exports involving animal-based products in return for crafted goods became vital for the economy. With more and more territories conquered, the Mongols' inclination toward trade intensified, partly due to their unique method of distributing the spoils of conquest. This method, known as kubi, involved every member of the ruling family becoming entitled to a share of the wealth acquired from various parts of the empire. This led to a fascinating cross-continental exchange of goods, with Mongol leaders in Persia sending spices and pearls to their relative rulers in annexed China, and those leaders sending goods such as medicine the opposite way. The Mongols understood the value of having individuals with knowledge and talents at their disposal, so the conveyance of war spoils was not restricted to only goods. Even when the majority of the populace of a captured land was massacred, the Mongol troops would gather artisans, interpreters, medics, and mathematicians to be distributed around the empire. This intricate kubi system had a profound impact on trade dynamics, creating a constant exchange of goods and people, connecting the Middle East and China. Remarkably, even during periods of intense conflict within different parts of the empire, the flow of goods remained relatively uninterrupted. The shared interest in the allocation of war booty and the exchange of goods through trade consistently outweighed competing interests. Due to all this wealth creation, trade became so much of a popular practice that the status of merchants became elevated to around that of government officials. This stood in huge contrast to the pre-empire hierarchy, which placed them only a step above robbers. Genghis Khan displayed exceptional generosity to merchants, often paying them double or triple their requested prices as a means to stimulate trade. To further incentivize merchants, special passports were granted to provide protection, accommodations, and exemption from local taxes. Marco Polo's golden tablet represented the highest level of these privileges. Standardization was a key aspect of the Mongol approach. They implemented a uniform system of weights and measures, ensuring consistency in trade transactions. Innovative financial practices further bolstered economic integration within the Mongol Empire. Mongol investors employed a wide array of assets, including metal coins, paper money, gold and silver ingots, and tradable goods. These investments primarily financed money lending and trade activities, providing a strong foundation for economic growth. All of this prosperity was made possible during the height of the empire in a stable and mostly peaceful 13th to 14th century era known as the Pax Mongolica. This period's significance on Eurasian economic well-being cannot be overstated. Mostly enforced by the Mongol military through their legal systems, the period was marked by innovation, booming trade, and the free exchange of goods and ideas across the Silk Road. It facilitated the movement of people, techniques, information, and ideas across the Eurasian landmass, serving as a conduit for the dissemination of knowledge, leading to advancements in astronomy, science, papermaking, printing, and more. The Mongol rule could be seen as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, its brutality in its conquering and sieging methods shocked and caused long-lasting resentment for millions of victims. On the other hand, once a nation was incorporated into the empire, it experienced a modern, nuanced system with guarantees of safety and societal improvements. But this could not last forever. The beginning of the end of the Mongol Empire occurred when Genghis Khan died in 1259 with no declared successor. This resulted in fighting between members of Tolui, Genghis' youngest son's family line, leading to multiple civil wars undermining the Khan's authority over the Mongol Empire. Eventually, it fractured into four khanates: the Chagatai in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Southwest Asia, the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe, and the Yuan dynasty in China. With this split, each fragmented section of the empire pursued their own interests, policies, and objectives. The Ilkhanate and the Yuan dynasty had close diplomatic relations and shared scientific and cultural knowledge, but military cooperation between all four Mongol khanates would never occur again. While a lack of unity mainly caused the steep decline, other factors did contribute. For example, the bubonic plague spread throughout the empire. Trade routes facilitated this spread, with infected fleas journeying on horses, camels, and cargoes. Biological warfare used by the Mongols may have worsened the spread, with disease-ridden corpses flung over castle walls to infect city inhabitants. The Black Death, originally killing 1/3 of China's population, spread to Europe, killing up to a half of their total population. Remote domains of the empire began to revolt following the plague's outbreak. The Mongols, demographically weakened, were unable to continue their tight rule. These revolts disrupted the production of goods and flow of trade, which ended the Pax Mongolica. In 1304, a peace treaty among the Khanates established the supremacy of the Yuan dynasty over the Western Khanates. So to some, this was viewed as the true successor of the Mongol Empire, so it is their story we will follow. Kublai Khan had completed the conquest of China by eliminating the Song dynasty in 1279. But over decades, Chinese resentment towards Mongol rule lingered and exacerbated due to the plague, eventually ramping up to breaking point. The first rebellion occurred in 1289 but failed. Kublai died in 1294, but drastic change didn't occur until the 1350s. The Red Turban Rebellion led to the overthrowing of the Yuan dynasty by the Ming dynasty in 1368. By this point, all other khanates had either split into even smaller regions of descendants, had been conquered or disintegrated. Therefore, it is widely acknowledged that the end of the Yuan dynasty in 1368 marked the true end of the Mongol Empire. What followed for Mongolia can only be described as a complete fall from grace. The Mongols had been completely expelled from China. The Mongol capital, Karakorum, had been looted by the Ming army. What remained was a rump state known as the Northern Yuan dynasty, which lasted until the 1600s. The now dominant ruling power, the Chinese Ming dynasty, invaded many times in the early 1400s, but ultimately struggled to conquer the vast Mongolian plateau. Economic blockades and restrictions to Silk Road trade were enforced, leading to stagnation within Mongolia. In the late 14th century, it was split into Western and Eastern Mongolia. Both parts struggled for domination, further weakening Mongolian strength. However, it reunited in 1439. With renewed power, Mongolia attempted to regain favorable trading conditions with the Chinese. When diplomacy failed to yield the desired results, dynamic leader Essentaish led a bold military campaign, during which a vastly outnumbered Oirat Mongol army, consisting of 20,000 astonishingly defeated a 500,000-strong Ming army. This victory led to the capture of the Zhengtong Emperor and a siege of Beijing. Essentaish's success further solidified his position, securing his self-declared status as Khan. However, his rule was short-lived, as rivals within the Mongol leadership rebelled against him and overthrew his regime. This pattern seemed to be too common during the 15th and 16th centuries. Rebellions and fractures, followed by brief reunifications, followed by short periods of prominence, only to be followed once again by breakdowns in structures. Constant turbulence reigned. Stability was non-existent. However, despite perpetual uncertainty, some important economic developments occurred during this period. Most of these were influenced by Mongolia's interactions with neighboring regions. Livestock husbandry remained essential to the Mongolian economy, with an increasing number of animals necessitating trade and exchange of goods with settled civilizations. The ban on trade by the Ming administration led to Mongol traders facing challenges such as low prices and substandard goods. In protest, Mongol traders would sometimes publicly incinerate the substandard Chinese goods they had purchased in front of Ming officials. Moreover, the Ming authorities frequently imposed exceptionally restrictive import quotas on trade. They went as far as prohibiting the sale of metal products to the Mongols, fearing that these materials might be repurposed for weapon production. The Mongols found it difficult to accept the Ming's dominance over them. Their cities were completely destroyed by the Chinese, so there was no division of labor between urban and rural economies that was characteristic in other cultures. However, while the Mongolian economy was still largely based on pastoralism, attempts at diversification occurred in peripheral Mongol domains. Altan Khan initiated grain cultivation, and cereal and horticulture production developed developed too. The late 15th and 16th centuries also witnessed somewhat of a cultural renaissance in Mongolia. Architecture, fine arts, sculpture, trigonometry, and literature flourished during this period. Any positivity to be found would not last, as changes to a Chinese dynasty would severely and negatively impact the future of Mongolia. What happened next led to the slow, sad ruin of Mongol culture. In 1635, after numerous divisions and splits, the rule of the Northern Yuan dynasty ended in Inner Mongolia and was handed to the new Qing dynasty of China. The Khalkha Mongols continued to rule Outer Mongolia until they were too submitted to the Qing in 1691. With the empire gaining firm control of the entirety of Mongolia, new administrative structures were put in place to subjugate Mongols to the mercy of the central government in Beijing. Key to this integration was the establishment of a tributary system where Mongolia was required to pay tribute to the Qing central government. This tribute included livestock, furs, and minerals. In return, Mongolia received protection and stability under Qing rule. Traditional Mongol clan structures were replaced by the Manchu banner system. The leader of each banner was no longer chosen by Mongol traditions, but instead by Qing authorities. Chinese culture began to seam its way into Mongol practices. For example, princes started to adopt Chinese architectural styles for their palaces, but more importantly, broader Mongol traditions faded away. The Qing government imposed strict restrictions on the movement of Mongols, disrupting the traditional nomadic lifestyle. They were forbidden from crossing the borders of their banners, even into other Mongol banners. Violating these restrictions would result in severe punishment. This deliberate isolation strategy aimed to keep the Mongol clans disconnected, preventing the formation of a united khanate and maintaining Qing control over the region. However, floods and famine in northern China meant that the Han Chinese demographic interwove with the Mongols through mass migration under the orders of the Qing government. Han Chinese farmers began to cultivate vast tracts of land, with tens of thousands of hectares in Inner Mongolia under their control by the 1780s. Due to heavy borrowing by Mongol princes, debts had to be paid off, so huge areas of banner lands were granted to Han Chinese farmers. Over time, the Mongol culture almost became indistinguishable from the Han. They were literally divided, conquered, isolated, and then integrated into a separate society. In terms of economic health, Mongols suffered as the Chinese favored Han trading firms. Exorbitant taxes and levies were issued against the Mongols, and with such little resources and unity, there was nothing they could do to protect themselves. The heaviest burden of the foreign exploitation was laid on the spine of the ordinary Mongolian laborers. Qing society was set into two main classes, nobles and commoners. While there were some notable Mongol nobles, the vast majority of Mongols were serfs, trapped into the service of their lord. This was the first time in Mongolian history where serfdom and forced slave labor was introduced to society. There were three forms of serfdom: serfs to the state, serfs to the Koshun rulers, and serfs to the supreme clergy. This miserable way of life continued for centuries for the Mongolian people. The nomadic way of life stopped. Innovations were limited. Under such harsh economic freedoms, the Mongols missed out on many Western developments like industry and new agricultural methods. Vassalage to China drained economic resources. The future was bleak. Mongolia had lost all sovereignty. That was until 1911. The Chinese famine of 1907 led to the deaths of 20 to 25 million people, causing an uprising. The Xinhai Revolution ended the Qing administration, the very last Chinese imperial dynasty, leading to the creation of the Republic of China. This entirely destabilized China, so the Mongol nobles finally saw an opportunity to act. Tensions between the two had risen since the Qing's new administration policies, which called for the Sinofication of Mongolia, meaning the entire country would be forcefully assimilated into Chinese culture through Han colonization. On the 29th of December 1911, the Mongols declared independence, creating the Bogd Khanate after centuries of foreign domination. This marked the beginning of Mongolia's quest for self-determination and can be compared to Genghis Khan's unification of tribes way back back in 1206 in terms of its importance for all Mongolia. The Chinese and now the Russians would not let this happen so easily. War ensued. Mongolian troops captured the city of Kobdo in August 1912, but due to lack of resources and the size of potential opposition, many were hesitant to join the effort. While many regions were taken by the Mongols, key regions such as Upper and Inner Mongolia fell into the hands of PR China. Attempts to take these territories ended in failure in 1914. The independence movement was not popular externally. Russia refused to sell weapons to the Khanate, and even the United Kingdom expressed concerns of revolts across Central Asia if Mongolia were to regain previous power. The pursuit for independence took a knock in 1915 with the Treaty of Kyakhta, where Outer Mongolia reluctantly accepted to an autonomy within China. China tightened its grip to control more areas with a full occupation in 1919, but scores of Russian white troops, recently defeated by the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution and in search of allies, helped drive the Chinese out of the Mongolian capital. The Bogd Khan's monarchic power and government were briefly restored, but it came to an end thanks to the Soviet Union and its Red Army. The Communists had arrived at Mongolia. The Russian White Army was destroyed by its Red Army, paving the way for a new Mongolian revolution. On the 9th of July 1921, Mongol communist revolutionaries, aided by the Soviet Union, sent a letter to Bogd Khan, informing him that power was now in the hands of the working-class people. The final Khanate had met its end, and the Mongolian People's Republic took its place. But did this also mean the end of independence from foreign influence? Well, while it certainly had its own government and policies, there's no doubt that Mongolia pretty much became a satellite state for the Soviet Union. It adopted most of its socialist policies and even engaged in Stalinist purges, indicating similar levels of brutal authoritarianism. So, by this point, Mongolia had experienced decades of unstable governance, wars, and broken social structures. Surely this took its toll on the economic well-being of the country. Exactly what did the Mongolian economy look like as it entered a new era? On the eve of the 1921 revolution, Mongolia had an underdeveloped, stagnant economy based on nomadic animal husbandry, eerily similar to the conditions present centuries prior. The Industrial Revolution had completely bypassed them. Even agriculture was practically non-existent. There was still a complete lack of technology, innovation, and progress. The majority of the population were illiterate nomadic herders, and the majority of the male labor force resided in monasteries, making little economic contribution. Aristocrats and monasteries owned the majority of the property, but this was to significantly change under communism. Creating a socialist economy was the ultimate challenge. It was just so different to its previous norms and traditions. All trade, transport, and finance were nationalized, and all production was collectivized. The first attempt to collectivize livestock failed miserably, so some privatization remained during a slow transition, which would not be complete until the 1950s. In the brutal attempts to force collectivization, several uprisings of monasteries occurred, all of which were violently suppressed. Stalinist purges of party leaders, lamas, and citizens who opposed the regime in any way resulted in the execution of between 20 to 35,000 Mongols. Many of these were Buddhist monks who simply refused to carry out communist orders. Slowly, some industry and farming initiatives, such as animal product processing and crop raising, showed signs of progress. Ulaanbaatar, now the capital of Mongolia, became the heart of the nation's industry. This sector was diversified into mining, goods production, and timber processing. Industry really ramped up during the Second World War. While Mongolia did not directly enter, most of their economy was concentrated on supplying the Soviet Union during their substantial war effort. As reward, Soviet aid into Mongolia increased, leading to the construction of the Trans-Mongolian Railway linking Moscow to the capital, as well as funding further industrial projects. Mao Zedong wanted Mongolia to reintegrate into China. They even built factories in the country to gain favor over the USSR, but both Mongolia and Russia rebuffed this idea, remaining closer diplomatically. This Soviet-Mongol partnership was embraced by the new Prime Minister Umjagin Tsedenbal, who reigned for most of the Cold War period from 1952 to 84. Economic improvements continued. In the 60s, food processing plants were established, continuing the industrial expansion. By now, socialism was fully integrated into the Mongolian economy. While this system was notorious for its failures in most cases, the reason for its success in this instance was simply how far behind and underdeveloped Mongolia was to begin with. Within a few decades, it went from purely animal farming to a diverse, industrialized economy. This was aided further by their participation in Comecon, the Soviet-led group of socialist states engaging in mutual economic assistance, leading to Eastern European nations engaging in financial and technical assistance. Trade with these nations grew substantially. In the 70s and 80s, new industrial centers were built outside of the capital. Populous towns were linked to factories with new transport systems. Some reforms came during Gorbachev's time as Soviet leader in the 80s. In late 1987 and early 88, after years of stagnation, Mongolia underwent a reorganization of its top-level state economic organizations, resulting in the formation of the State Planning and Economic Committee. The Ministry of Finance played a central role in formulating annual national budgets, while providing guidance for local budgets. These budgets changed drastically over the 20th century. In 1940, national expenditures were 122 million tugriks. In 1985, this rose to 5.6 billion tugriks. The structure of the economy also changed. In 1921, 100% of the economy was agrarian and nomadic based. In 1985, 18% was agriculture, 32% was industry, and 31% was trade and services. It is clear that Soviet intervention had largely diversified and benefited the Mongolian economy over the years. However, with the incoming dissolution of the USSR, along with its communist policies, one final revolution would change Mongolia for good. The Mongolian Revolution of 1990 put an end to Soviet influence. Multi-party elections brought democracy to Mongolia for the first time. The creation of the stock market and a privatization committee brought a capitalist market-based economy there, also for the very first time. The MPRP remained in power until 1996, where it was outvoted by the Democratic Union Coalition. It was not all good news at first. The dissolution of the USSR was immediately devastating for Mongolia, who had completely relied on its aid for decades. Its collapse caused an overnight fall in GDP by 1/3, leading to a deep recession. Inflation reached well above 100%. Unemployment rose, and basic goods were in constant short supply. Their transition into capitalism started at a heavy disadvantage, but it pressed on nevertheless. Economic growth began in 1994, but was unsustainable growth due to it mainly being attributed to over-allocation of bank credit. The Asian financial crisis in the late 90s also prevented consistent growth. This, along with natural disasters and the subsequent loss of millions of livestock, meant GDP growth fell from 3.2% in 1999 to a negligible amount by the turn of the millennium. The main problem with incorporating capitalism into a country like Mongolia is the complete lack of infrastructure and trade partners to facilitate the exponential growth rates we see in developed countries. Despite these difficulties, they completed privatization in the late 90s. By 2003, private companies made up 70% of their total GDP. In terms of worldwide trade, reliance is on the exportation of copper and other natural resources such as coal, tin, and gold. When worldwide copper prices fell 65% in 2008, Mongolia were hit especially hard. The financial crisis the same year further damaged its economy. economy, particularly due to having such a limited variety of trading partners to fall back on. As a result, exports decreased 26% that year. However, a smooth recovery followed, aided by the booming exports in its mining and Kashmir industries. Since the 1990 revolution, GDP per capita has increased over sixfold from $2,000 to $13,000. GDP currently sits at $47 billion, with its global ranking improving each year. Inflation and unemployment has consistently remained stable. Future analysis predicts Mongolia to continue with unstoppable growth. It has been coined the wolf economy, with claims it is ready to pounce as one of the world's fastest growing economies. Therefore, its transition into free markets and democracy can be viewed as an overall resounding success. Its ability to exploit its natural resources to wider markets and improve its industrial efficiency makes it a truly underrated emerging economy in the modern world. Mongolia's economic journey, spanning from the time of Genghis Khan to the modern era, is a fascinating story of adaptation and transformation. Genghis Khan's empire laid the foundations for trade and cultural exchange along the Silk Road, creating economic opportunities that persisted through centuries of nomadic herding. Centuries of vassalization to China set the proud Mongolians back, but the advent of socialism in the 20th century brought a lifeline through centralized planning and industrialization. However, the transition to capitalism in the 1990s marked a profound shift towards free trade, globalization, and stable economic growth. Today, Mongolia stands as a dark horse with a high HDI, a proud history, and a promising future all together. Thank you for watching.